Hi there, kids. There's a story for Helen and Eva and Griffin and Vivian and Xavier and Grace and Noel and Kimberly. The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. There were formerly a king and a queen who were so sorry that they had no children, so sorry that it cannot be expressed. They went to all the waters in the world. Vows, pilgrimages, all ways were tried, and all to no purpose. At last, however, the queen had a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. They found 7. That every one of them might give her a gift, as was the custom of fairies in those days. By this means, the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the ceremonies of the christening were over, all the company returned to the king's palace, where was prepared a great feast for the fairies. There was placed before every one of them a magnificent cover with a case of massive gold, wherein were a spoon, knife, and fork, all of pure gold, set with diamonds and rubies. But as they were all sitting down at table, they saw come into the hall a very old fairy, whom they had not invited, because it was above 50 years since she had been out of a certain tower, and was believed to be either dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but could not furnish her with a case of gold as the others, because they had 7 only made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy fancied she was slighted, and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies, who sat by her, overheard how she grumbled, and judging that she might give the little princess some unlucky gift, went, as soon as they rose from the table, and hid herself behind the hangings, that she might speak last, and repair, as much as she could, the evil which the old fairy might intend. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her for gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she should have a wonderful grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly well. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of music to the utmost perfection. The old fairy's turn came next. With a head shaking more with spite than age, she said that the princess should have her hand pierced with a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody fell a-crying. At this very instant, the young fairy came out from behind the hangings, and spake these words aloud. Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. Here is a picture of the old fairy giving her terrible bad gift to the new princess. It is true, I have no power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a profound sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the expiration of which a king's son shall come and awake her. The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, caused immediately proclamation to be made, whereby everybody was forbidden, on pain of death, to spin with a distaff and spindle, or to have so much as any spindle in their houses. About 15 or 16 years after, the king and queen being gone to one of their houses of pleasure, the young princess happened one day to divert herself in running up and down the palace. Then, going from one apartment to another, she came into a little room on the top of the tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her spindle. This good woman had never heard of the king's proclamation against spindles. "What are you doing there, goody?" asked the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who she was. "Ha!" said the princess. "This is very pretty. How do you do it? Give it to me that I may see if I can do so." She had no sooner taken it into her hand, whether being very hasty at it, somewhat unhandy, or that the decree of the fairy had so ordained it, ran it into her hand, and she fell down in a swoon. The good old woman, not knowing very well what to do in this affair, cried out for help. People came in from every quarter in great numbers. They threw water upon the princess's face, unlaced her, struck her on the palms of her hands, and rubbed her temples with Hungary water. But nothing would bring her to herself. And now the king, who came up at the noise, bethought himself of the prediction of the fairies, and judging very well that this must necessarily come to pass, since the fairies had said it, caused the princess to be carried into the finest apartment in his palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. One would have taken her for a little angel, she was so very beautiful, for her swooning away had not diminished one bit of her complexion. Her cheeks were carnation, and her lips were coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which satisfied those about her that she was not dead. The king commanded that they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly until her hour of awakening was come. The good fairy, who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years, was in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues off, when this accident befell the princess, but she was instantly informed of it by a little dwarf, who had boots of 7 leagues, that is, boots with which he could travel over 7 leagues of ground in one stride. The fairy came away immediately, and she arrived about an hour after in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out of her chariot, and she approved everything he had done, but as she had very great foresight, she thought when the princess should awake, she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in this old palace. And this is what she did. She touched with her wand everything in the palace, except the king and queen, governesses, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, scullions, guards, with their beef-eaters, pages, footmen. She likewise touched all the horses which were out in the stable, as well pads as others, the great dogs in the outward court, and pretty little Mopsy too, the princess's little spaniel, which lay by her in the bed. Immediately upon touching them, they all fell asleep, that they might not awaken before their mistress, and that they might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits at the fire, as full as they could hold of partridges and pheasants, did fall asleep also. All this was done in a moment. Fairies are not long in doing their business. And now, the king and the queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and put forth a proclamation that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all around about the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, twining one within another, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very top of the towers of the palace, and that too, not unless it was a good way off. Nobody doubted but the fairy gave herein a very extraordinary sample of her art, that the princess, while she continued sleeping, might have nothing to fear from any curious people. When 100 years were gone and past, the son of the king then reigning, who was of another family from that of the sleeping princess, being gone a-hunting on that side of the country, asked what those towers were which he saw in the middle of a great thick wood. Everyone answered according as they had heard. Some said that it was a ruinous old castle, haunted by spirits. Others, that all the sorcerers and witches of the country kept there their Sabbath or night's meeting. The common opinion was that an ogre lived there, and that he carried thither all the little children he could catch, that he might eat them up at his leisure, without anybody being able to follow him, as having himself only the power to pass through the wood. The prince was at a stand, not knowing what to believe, when a very aged countryman spake to him thus: "May it please your royal highness, it is now about 50 years since I heard from my father, who heard from my grandfather, say that there was then in this castle a princess, the most beautiful was ever seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and should be waked by a king's son, for whom she was reserved." The young prince was all on fire at these words, believing, without weighing the matter, that he could put an end to this rare adventure, and pushed on by love and honor, resolved that moment to look into it. Scarce had he advanced towards the woods when all the great trees, the bushes and brambles, gave way of themselves to let him pass through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, which he went into, and what a little surprised him was that he saw none of his people could follow him, because the trees closed again as soon as he had passed through them. Here's a picture of the prince walking through the dense forest by himself. No one else can go there. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, which he went into, and what a little surprised him was that he saw none of his people could follow him. He came into a spacious outward court, where everything he saw might have frozen up the most fearless person with horror. There reigned all over a most frightful silence. The image of death everywhere showed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals, all seeming to be dead. He, however, very well knew, by the ruby faces and pimpled noses of the beef-eaters,